In this video, we're going to show you how to use the company data and client data CRM database that's built into the PropulsePack Wizard. That is good for storing information about people in your company, clients, or areas that you want to use to preload your projects with more efficiently, so you don't have to retype the same information multiple times. So every time you go and create a document project and you're picking your chapters and so on, you can fill in the company data and client data screens. Now, the way the wizard is set up is whatever information you entered in the initial setup screen will be your default company data. So if you set up these values in the initial setup screen, it'll be populated here. Now you can edit these using edit tag labels and defaults. That will edit what the wizard database has for its defaults for every future project for your company data. Now this drop down here, we've set up multiple records in the company data database, and we'll show you where that is in the preferences in a moment. And that lets you have multiple preset lists of information that you can load in. So say in this example, if you have multiple people in your company who may be writing proposals, you can set them each up in the database and have their name, address, title, and so on be automatically populated when you select them from the drop-down for each project. Same thing with the client data. Now normally the client data database will not be automatically populated. There'll be some defaults here you can set in the preferences. Now we've preset a few records in the client database, and this is for, say, if you have multiple regions or cities, counties or so on, states that you want to set up with preloaded information, so you don't have to retype things like the city name, state, zip code, the default area codes, and so on. You can see how as we select these records, it will just load whatever we put into the database. Now this is also good for, say, if you have clients that you're going to create multiple documents for. Maybe you do lots of projects for a particular client and you just want to preload their information into the database. That works as well. Now every time we create a new document project and create a document, that client information gets saved into the database so you can select it from this drop down for a future project. So say, for example, we'll fill this in for a fictional client. Okay, so we filled out a fictional client here for this particular project. We'll save that. Generated a little document for this client. Now this isn't really important for the purposes of the demo, but you'll see how that client's name, address is put into the document in various places, like the cover letter, the title page, and the back page, and so on. So this is where our company data goes into. And usually on the title page is where our company data and client data, names and addresses, titles go. Whatever we put into the client data project name will go here. Now let's say in the future we come back, create a new project, so we need to create a new document for the same client. You'll see that client's already in the database. We can select it and load it. Now we'll show you where in the wizard you actually set all of this up and configure the settings. So as you're saving projects, creating projects, that's when the wizard is adding new records into the database for you. And in the wizard preferences down here is where you can configure things, update the records, and so on. Just come to the Data and Display tab, click the first button here, Edit Company and Client Database, and you'll have all the options you need to get in and configure all the individual records using these Manage buttons, and you can configure how the records are used by default up here. So say if you want to speed up your data entry a little bit and automatically have every single project preloaded with a certain set of data, you just pick the record you want. So say if Joel, in this case, is the person who's going to be writing the bulk of the proposals, you want to just default them. You just select their record, and you don't have to then select it from every single project you create. Same thing for the client database. You probably wouldn't be selecting a specific client as your default, but what if you set up some records here for local areas that you do most of your business in that you want to just preload data from, and most of your work is from one particular city, you can just pick one of your records to preload a little bit of data from for every future project. And you'll see these are based off what we call the nicknames. That's the most common way you're going to use the populate from in the client database. Now you can turn off these databases as well if you don't want them to show up in the project screen. If you want to only show nicknames, which are basically the only way nicknames get created is if you manually add a nickname. So that way, for example, if you're creating lots of projects, if you don't want to see that whole list of clients from the drop down in the client screen every time you say you only want to see the ones that you've set specific nicknames for, you can check this box here. That just helps you tailor what you see on the project screens. Now to edit individual records, so to manage your databases, add records, update, delete, and so on, just click these buttons. So we started off with a blank screen. We can just type anything we want in here and add a new record, or we can pick one that we've already pre-created. We can make an update, we can change settings, and then click the update. We can remove one of these records and so on. The nicknames will start out being blank. So if we want to set up the nickname database for individual, say, people or areas, locations, and so on, you can set nicknames. Once you've set a nickname, the nickname is what will display in the drop-down list. If you do not set a nickname, it will use the first name, last name, company. Now the databases also work off of first name, last name, company name as the unique identifiers. A combination of those three, we know it's a unique record. So it won't add it to the database again if you're creating, say, a new project with the same first name, last name, company name. And if same thing over here, we want to manage the client database. It's exactly the same screen, just a different list of records. You can see the Bellevue, Redmond, Seattle. These are locations we've set up with just a small amount of information to preload new records from. And we see we've set a nickname since we're not using the first name, last name, company name. So you either have to have a nickname set or first name, last name, company name. Whatever you type in is what's going to get loaded in. But there's a couple special strings, default, just the word default, that will make the wizard ignore that field for the record, and it will retain whatever the default is at the highest level of the preferences settings for your tags. So for example, that's a good way to prevent this database from overriding something you have at the higher level in the wizard's company database. And you can also use the word blank, for example, and that will cause the wizard to completely remove the tags in the database, replace it with a completely blank string. So say if you really never use address 2, address 3, and you don't want to have to manually remove the address 2, address 3 tags from the final created proposal, you can just put the words blank in here, and that will basically remove it completely from the assembled proposals. Now the high-level defaults are stored in the Data and Display tab in the Edit Mail Merge fields. So you'll see the defaults over here. This is where we store in the wizard those values you entered in the very first setup screen when you first ran the wizard, and it asks you some questions to answer. It asks you your name and address information. That's where all of that information went. So that way you can edit that stuff you entered in initially when you first set up the wizard by going into the Company 1 and Company 2 tabs here. And you can also add defaults for all of the contract company tags, custom tags, and so on, if you want to set your own defaults. So what we mentioned earlier in that CRM database where you can put the word default, that will make the wizard retain whatever defaults you'd put in this preferences screen over here. So that gives you a lot of options for how to configure the databases for how you best want to work. All right. So that is how you use the customer and client CRM database. And we'll illustrate a couple of those custom settings now that we have a little extra data in here. We're just going to Data and Display, Edit Company and Client Database. So let's say we want Joel to always be the person whose record gets used in new projects. And for the client database, we want to hide all the individual client records and only show the nicknames. So we'll just check that. So we've made two customizations here. Now when we add a new project, go to the company data, you'll see Joel's record was automatically loaded, and we can override that by clicking the drop down. And for the client data, we only see the nicknamed records. So as we add more and more projects, 10, 20, 100 projects, that list is only going to show the nicknamed ones. It won't get cluttered up with all of our individual records. Now, say if you do have, out of your many, many records for your clients, a handful that you want to be able to select from to reload for, because you know you're going to be creating multiple documents for them, just go find those records in the database, in the preferences, add a nickname for them, and then those ones will show up. If you want everything to show up, just don't check the nicknames checkbox. So that is how you use the company and client CRM database in the wizard. Let us know what you think in the comments below, and click subscribe to keep up on the latest proposal writing tips with Proposal Kit.